All right, three, two, one. This is SITREP. We're still here at the Manila Dialogue for the West Philippine Sea. With us today is Georgi Engelbrecht from the Crisis Group here in Manila. So, Georgi, tell us a little bit about yourself, I guess, to start off, and what Crisis Group does here in the Philippines.
Okay, so magandang hapon, and so I'm the only person here in Crisis Group covering the Philippines. We are a conflict prevention organization, so we look into armed conflicts across the world, and of course here in the Philippines, we try to understand why do conflicts happen, what can be done to mitigate their impact, and what are the prospects for conflict resolution more broadly. And we focus specifically on internal challenges in the Philippines, as well as, of course, the theme of this conference, the maritime disputes in the South China Sea.
And it's speaking of the maritime disputes and speaking of conflicts, this is exactly why you're here. This is exactly where you're participating. So, based on Crisis Group's assessments here in the Philippines, what do you think about growing tensions in the West Philippine Sea? We've had recent collisions just 3 weeks ago with maritime vessels of the Philippine Coast Guard being harassed. It seems like an increasingly assertive and belligerent Chinese military presence in the South China Sea. What does the outlook look like for the Philippines from your perspective?
All right, so I think the maritime disputes are here to stay. This is the reality. We did a report on the South China Sea dispute a couple of years ago, where we looked into the Philippines, Vietnam, and also different understandings of US and China vis-a-vis the international order that exists in this region right now. And actually, more than a month ago, we produced a report that looked at Philippines' strategy to modernize its defense forces, where we try to see how does the maritime dispute affect Philippine strategic thinking and what can be done. So, not surprisingly, we identified two key areas of, interest. First, the Philippines should engage in diplomacy, nonetheless, still, because we believe that a peaceful resolution of any conflict is possible and should be, of course, worked towards. But on the other hand, we also know deterrence really matters. And this is very important at this time where we don't have tensions in the South China Sea, but also East China Sea, across the Taiwan Strait, Korean Peninsula. Many of these theaters are interconnected. So I think every country has its own task to deal with it. And the Philippines, being at the receiving end of Chinese coercive action, needs to be inventive and creative in ways to tackle this situation.
And naturally, in a lot of forums like this, there's a lot of finger pointing on who is the one causing the tensions, who's the one causing aggression in the West Philippine Sea. And it's not the role of Crisis Group to point fingers, but naturally it's your job to help propose policies to contain and to mitigate tensions. And so, in your opinion, what can the Philippines, specifically the Marcos administration, do in order to, what options do we have on the table other than what Jay Terry said yesterday, continuing the transparency initiative, continuing our diplomacy and hoping for the best?
Well, in our recent report, we identify three major directions that need to happen. And the good news is we believe that the Philippines is already on track. But as always, it's about filling it with more detail-oriented work and maybe more specifics in terms of policies and, of course, continuation. So the first is modernization of its armed forces. We have heard about Horizon 3. We know what the Philippines is doing. But I think the key really is to make sure that defense modernization mirrors the strategic direction of the country. And the strategic direction of the country, specifically in the South China Sea, has also something to do with the CATSI, the Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense Concept. We believe that it would be good to fill that concept with, of course, more specifics, with more meat on the skeleton, so to speak. I think the Philippines right now, for instance, tries to be more present at sea. It tries to see what is out there at sea. It knows that right now it cannot counter China head on, but I think it is very important to work on maritime domain awareness, to work together also with other countries to make sure there are the capacities of the Philippines to really be present along the maritime domain and along, of course, the air. And at the same time, we need to talk to adversaries or opponents. And I think for the Philippines, it means Second Thomas Shoal right now for quite some time has been rather stable. Many people have not seen the provisional agreement with China, but ultimately it keeps the situation quiet, relatively speaking. Whereas tensions around Scarborough Shoal are, of course, increasing. So I think from a very practical perspective, it is good to maintain a diplomatic channel with Beijing, but at the same time, the Philippines needs to coordinate with the United States, with Japan, with Australia, about possibilities to make sure that more coercive actions will not occur. Because I think the key question will be, what if China will decide to build stronger fortifications on Scarborough, or if it really decides to put up military installations there, then the pressure will be on the Philippines and its allies to respond. And I think that could drive a dangerous escalation signal, which means how can we already now send China a message, or other players for that matter, that a peaceful resolution is still better than armed conflict? And what, of course, makes it very challenging is to find a response to the gray zone. Because as we heard yesterday, or as one of the Chinese delegates described it, military operations below the level of armed conflict, short of war, once the response is already relatively heavy-handed, it would invite the other side to come in. So the dilemma is, if you send in your navy, the other side will use it as an excuse to send more of their navy ships, and then we have a maritime crisis. So the tricky part here is to find the right response. And I think right now the Philippines tries to work diplomatically with its partners. It conducts exercises. It tries to beef up Air Force and Navy. But I think it needs more of that. And we need to have sustainability beyond, for example, 2028.
I guess my last few questions to flesh out the West Philippine Sea issue is you mentioned about needing to, as repeating what Commodore Torriello said yesterday, increasing the cost on China and increasing our work with our allies. However, there are some people in Philippine politics who would claim that a lot of the actions conducted by the Philippine Coast Guard is in the end provoking China, and you heard the Chinese say this also. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but as a person assessing tensions and how they escalate, perhaps you can respond to claims that it is the Philippines that's claims both domestic and foreign that claims that the Philippines is the one escalating tensions in the West Philippine Sea.
Well, I think what really matters here is defensive intent, and you can break it down to different actors. I do believe that President Marcos Jr. himself said on several occasions, we want to have a dialogue, we seek the conversation, and we are not here to cause any trouble. One maritime incident that the panels yesterday and today discussed was the issue that happened early 2023 after President Marcos visited Beijing. That was the beginning of the deterioration of the situation. And I think the Philippines has tried to say that we don't mean any harm here. We have a clear intent that we want to be in our EZ, not harm anyone. And the demand is that the fishermen can fish, essentially, right? I think what makes it difficult for China to fully understand is the fact that they will look at the maritime dispute also through the lens of the great power competition. So if the Philippines communicates it is autonomous, it has agency, it doesn't mean no harm, the alliance already itself makes China perhaps think that the Philippines is not to be trusted. And how can the strategic trust essentially be bridged? I don't know, but I think that it is crucial that the Philippines continues to highlight its, defensive intent, and also to make sure that talks are on the table. Even National Security Advisor Anyo mentioned that yesterday evening. There's no one here who would be against the COC, and that alone is a message to Beijing. But the other side of the coin is, of course, to show that the Philippines is taking its security seriously.
And naturally, we can't let you off in an interview without asking you about a work that you've been heavily involved in for years, which is the peace process in Mindanao. I guess two questions. First of all, we were talking yesterday about a recent conflict over in Basilan that made national headlines. Perhaps you can dispel some allegations about that, whether it was a siege over Basilan, whether it was not. And then secondly, perhaps give us your overall perspective on how the peace process is going in Mindanao, especially under the Marcos administration. Do you think it's doing positively? What does it look like for disarmament of the armed groups in Mindanao?
All right, thank you very much for this. Let me just maybe start with the second and then finish with Basilan. I do believe the good news in the peace process is that it still exists. It's still on track, even though we have a slowing down of a lot of measures in the last months. The Philippine peace process is the only peace process in the world, apart from Colombia, that is not falling apart. And I think that puts a lot of responsibility on all the actors to really wrap it up. Because even from the perspective of national security, if Mindanao is not stable, it will make it harder for the Philippines to truly move on to its external posture, right? I think right now, parts of the peace agreement, unfortunately, are stuck. The MILF has put an end to decommissioning for now, on the grounds that the government was perceived to intervene in internal Bangsamoro politics. It changed the chief minister of the Bangsamoro region, and the normalization program is seriously delayed. Now, it did not result in anything kinetic in war or in conflict, but we do see a lot of nervousness that exists on the ground. At the same time, the elections that were supposed to happen actually this October, they were postponed. They are now postponed to latest March 30 next year, but there's a possibility that they will be postponed again. Now, we can debate about the merits and the issue of democratization in the Bangsamoro, but I think the point remains this political track ideally needs to finish at some point in time. We need to complete the disarmament, and we need to give disengaged, demobilized rebels their packages. We need to also make sure that other people with guns will not do any harm to human security in the Bangsamoro and hurt normal people. And I think for that we need more energy in the peace process. The peace process is not broken down, but I think it needs to be boosted. And actually, in the beginning of the Marcos Jr. administration, we were really on track, but throughout time, as perhaps with many aspects of Philippine policies, politics ended up sabotaging a lot of good work. And this is really the critical point. Now, what happened in Basilan was basically a symptom of the challenges. What we had was a shooting incident with a response that perhaps was not according to the wishes of people close to the aggrieved party. And these disputes in Mindanao sometimes can escalate under certain conditions. So I think the media has, of course, not fully portrayed the details and the nuance of all these things. I do not believe that Tipo in Basilan was under siege, but we definitely had presence of armed men. The local government unit was relatively clear about what it felt, a massive presence of people, some of whom were MILF. But I do believe that the good news was both sides managed to de-escalate. MILF, the military, but also the provincial government. The question is, how many more fires do we need to extinguish before the next fire will be too much? And that's why it's really important to have a conversation and to re-engage the peace process. We would recommend that both peace panels would get together and really have a session and thrash out details that remain, unfortunately not resolved. The MILF ideally needs to continue decommissioning, but also the government must play its part. If these puzzle pieces are not in place, then we will have gradual community frustration. And then the question is, what is next? I personally do not believe in another large-scale conflict in Mindanao. Those days are perhaps over. But armed violence can always reoccur. And that is the danger. Because I believe every barangay deserves to be living in peace and without conflict. And I think if this process is still slightly taken aside or not fully tackled, we will have more of these incidents. And then perhaps we will have a true siege. And that's what we really need to avoid.
And last question on our part, as a man who's worked extensively to bring peace to the Philippines for the last many years here, what is your outlook on the peace situation, the security situation in the Philippines, on the closing years of this admin, and as we transition into 2028 and the start of the next one? What does it look like for the Philippines in the next half decade?
Yeah, that's a very great question, but also, of course, not quite easy to pinpoint. I think for now, we really need to see for the next 2 years plus, how will the next years of President Marcos Jr. evolve? We already have a lot of issues related to the domestic stability, various perceptions of coups or whatnot, and instability, a lot of noise on social media. I think what is really important is to let the process occur with the Bangsamoro to conclude the peace agreement. At the same time, we will also have the ASEAN year next year, with the Philippines being ASEAN chair, so that will be very important for the South China Sea dispute management. And then, of course, we will have the very important year 2028. It is not only the year of the elections, and everything here in the Philippines, I believe, or if not everything, a lot of things will depend on the president. So we will need to see who will be in charge in 2028. To an extent, we can probably see some continuity, but it's also possible that we will see change. So I think for now, it's important to lock in key deliverables, both internally and externally, to build up the resilience of the Philippines, to be stable, and to be, again, on track that needs to be made. Final point, we're also working on a short piece on the climate-related impact on conflict. And as you can see, that is a huge issue right now. We have had typhoons, more are incoming, and other contexts have told us there will be also an impact on the social fabric, on existing conflicts about resources. And I think it is very important that the Philippines will continue to work on it through institutions and through work on the local level, I believe.
Thank you so much, Georgi Engelbrecht of the Crisis Group here in Manila. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Okay. Cool.